But like Tim Pool and her have this whole beef going on right now. I mean, really, Candace doesn't have any issue, or at least she hasn't said she has any issues with Tim Pool. But Tim Pool's really going after her for not paying attention to the things that he says are important. And there are more important things going on. There's always a lot going on. That's the whole point of what they do. They try to overwhelm you. See, most people are very busy with their day to day lives, their kids, their job. They work, 40, 50 hours a week. When they're off work, they're tired. They've got enough things stressing them out. The last things that people want to do is spend their free time, being bombarded with just all sorts of negative news. People want to get off work. They want to spend time with their family, their friends. They want to drink beers and watch football. It's understandable. I get it. But it's one of the reasons why we are where we are now. And this is something that I think is very important, everything that's going on in Venezuela. We're really moving towards potential full on war with Venezuela. And even Colombia came out yesterday. Colombia's leader made a statement saying, hey, because this was in regards to somebody brought up, cocaine production in Colombia, and Trump had mentioned Colombia as well. And, Colombia's leader was saying, like, hey, look, this isn't a road you want to go down, and Maduro's resisting, and we're attacking these drug boats, and now they're talking about potential war crimes. There's one of the drug boat strikes back in September. Apparently, they hit the boat. They could see in the video a couple people survived and then got back on, and then they struck the boat again. And this guy right here, Admiral Frank Bradley, is kind of taking the heat. He's kind of being the fall guy, which supposedly the orders were coming from Hegseth. Hegseth said, kill them all. It's hard to tell who's really saying what, but I mean, if you go with the logic that we're using for why we should take out Maduro, they're saying, well, Maduro's the head of the snake. He's the head of the cartels in Venezuela's military. So they're saying basically the buck stops with Maduro because he's at the top. Well, so does that mean that Trump should be the one getting the blame for this? They're not really going after the corrupt officials within the Venezuelan government. And again, I'm not saying that Maduro's not involved with it, but they're using all of the propaganda to say, well, you have these guys within the Venezuelan military that are corrupt and they're trafficking drugs and they're bringing the drugs into America. And Glenn Beck actually had some guy on, Jason Buttrill, and he was pushing the propaganda really hard, talking about the drugs, talking about the terror, basically saying that Venezuela is a terrorist hub, saying, Iran and Russia are sending terrorists there to train, which there are definitely connections between Russia and Venezuela and Iran. That's kind of that whole enemy of my enemy is a friend thing. But Jason Buttrill was pushing the propaganda way, way better than Representative Salazar. I had that video the other day talking about Representative Salazar out there point blank saying, number one reason we need to go into Venezuela is the oil. Buttrill was a little more professional in the way he wrote out the propaganda. He used the drug threat and then talking about the terrorist state. And it's kind of like how we took the cartels in, the Zetas cartel, and they trained with our special forces at Fort Bragg. You can just look that up. They were brought in. They were supposed to be this paramilitary group that was going to go fight the cartels. And then after we trained them up, they went and became one of the most notorious cartels in Mexico. But that's another story. But similar to why we need to go to war with Venezuela. And then Buttrill follows that up with, Russia and China are helping Venezuela skirt sanctions by buying oil from them, which I, why would China not buy oil from them? If we've put sanctions on them and Venezuela is selling their oil at a cheaper rate than market prices for oil, then doesn't it make sense for China to go in there and buy that oil at a discount? And then here's a old article: Russia building arms plants in Venezuela. This is 2009, December 1st, 2009, so 16 years ago. Russia building arms plants in Venezuela. Now, again, this is coming from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which is a propaganda front for NATO and U.S. interest. I mean, Radio Free Europe goes back to the Cold War times. It's been around for decades. But it's talking about Russia building arms plants in Venezuela to produce AKs. And I remember I found this article like 16 years ago when I was first really getting into all this stuff. And I remember thinking at the time, like, why are we not doing anything about this? I remember thinking, like, we're turning a blind eye because see, now it's back in the media again, because again, we're really trying to push the propaganda to justify getting involved in Venezuela. Here's a Council on Foreign Relations article from 2018. A U.S. military intervention in Venezuela would be a disaster. And then here we go. Who do we have? Marco Rubio, or Narco Rubio, as I believe Kurt Metzger called him, which is pretty funny. So calls for U.S. military intervention in Venezuela are growing. Most recently from Senator Marco Rubio. Says they're not going to foreclose the military option. And then it says, yet as devastating as the regime of President Nicolas Maduro has been for Venezuela and its people, and as compelling the need for change, a military response, especially one led by the U.S., is unrealistic and would be counterproductive. Yeah, but here we are, 7 years later, still pushing the propaganda, still trying to go in for regime change. And all we've done is become more aggressive. We've become more aggressive with Venezuela. We've become more aggressive with Russia, basically funding a proxy war through Ukraine. We've done missile strikes on Iran. And we wonder why we're moving closer to an actual war with our troops being sent in. Now, I watched another interview with Professor John Mersheimer, which he's always has a really good take on things. He was a professor at University of Chicago, and he always has like a much more informed, like nuanced opinion than I would say most people. And I really like listening to the things he says. But Mersheimer is saying that he's pretty optimistic. He doesn't think that Trump is going to put boots on the ground in Venezuela. He thinks a lot of this is kind of just saber rattling, hopefully able to maybe implement regime change without actually going in there. And I hope that's right. I hope that's accurate, because we do not need to be involved in these wars. These wars they have bankrupted our country. I mean, we were already broke, but I mean, think of all the trillions of dollars now that we've been putting into this global empire. And because of that, they've debased your currency. See, they always want to say, oh, it's these greedy corporations. That's why the prices of things are going up. No, it's because your currency has been destroyed, because we're borrowing money to finance the military-industrial complex, to finance, all the other corrupt things that we're doing. They're funneling money from the taxpayer to all their buddies through subsidies, through bailouts, through everything. And then the result of that is debasement of your currency. And that's why prices are going up. That's why you can't afford to buy groceries. It's because we're funding all of this intervention all around the world. And we got to stop.